I went on a 29 days epic trip around Kenya. A trip I could never imagine to do so soon or anytime soon. It has always been my dream in life to visit each and every African country. But before I get to do that, I had to first travel to every corner of my own country, Kenya. This is the story of how all this trip came together and all the destinations we visited. It was October 10th, exactly 7:29 p.m. late evening, and I was busy working when I got an email. It was two guys asking if I could join them on a trip around Kenya from 28th of December 2020 to 30th January 2021. Being the skeptical Kenyan I am, I thought to myself, what kind of elaborate scam is this? But then I remembered how 2020 was, and so by 7:47 p.m. I had already replied to the email that I am ready to go. We exchanged more emails and later on switched to WhatsApp, where we shared a route map of places of interest. You see, I haven't traveled beyond our borders. Apart from that one time I crossed to Tanzania for a night party and came back to Kenya still at night, so that doesn't count. The two guys I was to travel with, on the other hand, had traveled to over 50 countries, from all the stories they got to tell me. More than 20 African countries. I was a total novice between experts. The two guys are also very private people, and I promise to keep their privacy. They are a couple, and I will refer to them as Jen and Albert, which is not their real names. And here is a picture of us standing in front of Koitobo's Peak in Mount Elgon, but we will get there. Fast forward several months later, and Jen and Albert finally arrived in Kenya, and we got to do a quick run of Nairobi, visiting the Nairobi National Museum, eating some food in Kilimanjaro restaurant, walking around the streets and having dinner at the Carnival restaurant, which is one of those hyped must-do things in Kenya. Well, sometimes you just have to feed the hype, but then after this, that's where the real trip starts. The day started early morning, as will every other day after this. I met Jen and Albert at the Boma Hotel by 8:30 am. We received the rental car and we set off. We made a quick stop at the Hub Karen Mall and bought a few camping stuff and cutleries. Unfortunately, we almost never used any of those, and we were off again. Driving outside Nairobi, we went down the magnificent Rift Valley escarpments towards Mai Mahiu. We made our first stop at the Travelers Church, also known as the Mai Mahiu Catholic Church. This was an interesting stop because this church is the smallest known church in Kenya, and possibly the second smallest in the world. We walked around, took some pictures, and we were off again. The plan was to drive all the way to Maasai Mara, but Albert decided last minute we check out Mount Suswa. I had already visited Mount Suswa before, and so it was interesting to visit it again because it's quite a stunning mountain. We reached the peak after climbing through a treacherous route. At the top, we spent a few minutes and we were off again. While leaving Mount Suswa, we experienced our first mishap, which was a tire puncture. At this point, we also realized we were missing one tool which would help with lowering the spare wheel tire, and ended up waiting 30 minutes for someone to pass who was able to help us with the pliers which we used to lower the tire. We did manage to change the tire, and by the time we got to Narok, it was late in the evening. We fixed the tire at a nearby repair shop and decided to go to Maasai Mara the next day very early in the morning. The day ended in a roadside hotel in Narok town. I did a terrible job of documenting the foods we ate, but the entire time we made sure we only ate Kenyan local foods. At no point did we eat any commercialized foods like burgers, pizzas and the likes. It was always typical Kenyan foods like githeri, lots of ugali, sukuma wiki and different types of meats. This is my hotel room in Narok. It costs 1,000 shillings, so that's the bed, a chair and a desk and a TV. Let's just walk in. It's a very, very small room, but yeah, that's it. Here's the toilet. that is how the room looks like. And what you're going to do is tomorrow we're going to go to Mara, like I think 5:30. We'll leave Narok 5:30 so that we can reach Narok maybe 7 a.m. Then we will just do like a thorough drive of the place, so that if we like it, we're going to camp there. If we don't, then you can just exit and go to a different place, because Mara is extremely expensive. Yeah, so that has been day one. Time to just shower and sleep, because in Mara, if you decide to camp, it means maybe no showering for like a day or two, or like skipping a day. Because it's just like pure camping. You have nothing, you have to do everything on your own. So yeah, that's a little hectic, if you can think of it, but again, that's the fun of it. Yeah, so that has been day one after a very long day. See you tomorrow. 5:30 a.m. we were off heading to Maasai Mara, and when we were less than 30 kilometers from the main gate, the tire that had been repaired got another puncture. The tire was unrepairable, and going to a national park without a spare is a bad idea. We had to retrace back to Narok town to buy a new tire. That set us back 3 hours, and we were off again to the park and reached the park 10 a.m. in the morning. This was our first time to the Maasai Mara, and we all had this thought that Maasai Mara is overrated. We were so wrong. Right from entering the Sekenani gate, you are greeted with zebras, monkeys, and antelopes. The roads are mostly well maintained, and the drive turned to be very scenic with beautiful landscapes. Jen and Albert had been avoiding to travel to Kenya because it's a popular tourism destination. Because of the pandemic, they thought it would be a very good opportunity to visit, since most places will not be full of people or cars, and their argument was quite correct. There were not so many vehicles in the park, despite the day being a New Year's Eve. The drive was very fun, and we got to explore the park for hours. We saw lions lying on the grass, elephants taking a stroll, giraffes staring at us, and buffaloes grazing in large herds. Maasai Mara did leave something in my heart, and even with all the hype, I will highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't visited. We visited the Serena Lounge, which is inside the park, and had some dinner before we retired to our campsite. The campsite was not very well maintained, and it was very bushy. The rains made the night worse for me because my 1-year-old tent had a small leak, which made my feet wet the entire night. We even forgot 2020 was coming to an end, and morning will be a new year, 2021. The day started early as usual, which was a relief for me because I'd hardly had any sleep from all the rain. We started our early morning drive in Maasai Mara, still marveling at the stunning landscapes. And then one of the rarest things happened to us. People visit national parks for years and never get to see a leopard. Leopards are known to be masters of disguise, and they can sit very high on trees, making them very hard to spot. We were very lucky to find a leopard strolling along the road. We followed it for 25 minutes, and it was definitely our highlight of Maasai Mara. We exited Maasai Mara around 11:40 am through the Olololo gate, and our next destination will be the Thimlich Ohinga prehistoric site. The journey was through a rough road that is easy to get stuck in. We passed through Migori town, which is the nearest big town, and then proceeded to Thimlich Ohinga. Thimlich Ohinga is referred to as the best preserved prehistoric site in Africa, only after the one that is found in Zimbabwe. At the location, you get to learn about Luo culture and get to see the structure that was built in the 16th century and is still standing. We didn't stay long in Thimlich Ohinga because we were running late and it was raining, and we intended to reach Homa Bay town where we will spend the night.
So Thimlich Ohinga is just showing us or telling us the Luo culture and tradition.
Okay.
We are Luos, one of the tribes in Kenya is called Luos,
Yes.
and now their culture and is being shown here. Luos are polygamous people.
Okay.
Ever since, they are still practicing that up to now.
Okay.
So this one is a typical Luo homestead. A man with 3 wives.
Okay.
So this is the arrangement.
Okay.
If you enter into a Luo homestead, assuming this is the gate,
Okay.
the house, the main house, which the main door is facing the main entrance,
Okay.
that is the house of the first wife ever.
Okay. Okay.
Now on the right hand side appears the house of the second wife. Then at the left, the house of the third wife.
Okay.
This one is called Mekai, the first wife. Nyachera in Luo language.
Okay.
Then Krero,
Okay.
the third wife. Then between the first and the third, we have the house of the owner of these wives.
Okay.
Yes, the owner of this homestead.
Okay.
That is his house. It is also acting as the administration block.
I don't have many pictures or videos of Homa Bay town, but it is a very busy town and its biggest economic activity can be said to be fishing since it's right next to Lake Victoria. The night in Homa Bay town was not that pleasant though, as the hotel we slept in was right in the town and there was a lot of noise from motorbikes, a church that was having a late night worship, and a club which was playing loud music up to 11 PM in the night. Then there was a group of football lovers who were maybe drunk and decided to review the game they watched very loudly right outside the hotel. Coming to think of it, I had the worst sleep of the trip in Homa Bay. Maybe after a few days staying there, I would have become numb to the noise, but luckily morning came and we were off to the next destination. We drove some 30 kilometers to Ruma National Park. The park is also the only place in Kenya where you can spot the rowan antelopes. The park had dense shrubs, making spotting animals a bit hard. We drove for about 2 hours and we didn't see any rowan antelope. In plenty were the Rothschild giraffes. If we gave it more time, maybe we would have been lucky to spot one, but then we exited the park and drove to Rusinga Island. First attraction was the Rusinga Bridge, which according to the locals was a construction that was long overdue. The bridge connected the mainland to the island, making it accessible, unlike previous times when you had to use a boat to the island. Driving around Rusinga Island was amazing. The entire island was bigger than I had imagined before, with the length being 16 kilometers from end to end. Another attraction in Rusinga Island was the Mboya Mausoleum. Mboya is one of the founding fathers of Kenya and helped shape politics in Kenya after gaining independence in 1963. Unfortunately, he met his untimely death in what is a mystery that is being discussed today. The mausoleum is shaped like a bullet, which is how he died. We paid our respects and drove out of Rusinga Island back to the mainland, ready to visit another island. We took a boat for an estimated 40 minutes drive to Mfangano Island. The boat ride was very fun, and at that point it was the longest boat ride I had ever done. We made a quick stop at the Abasuba Peace Community Museum, which unfortunately didn't have much to see, and the place looked abandoned. We got on the boat again and went to the other side of the island to visit the Mawanga rock site. This was a quick stopover looking at the rock cuts that date 4,000 years old. We took the boat ride back to Mbita and quickly proceeded to the ferry which connects Mbita to Luanda Kotieno, or loosely, Southern Nyanza with Northern Nyanza. The sunset from the ferry was beautiful and the ride was very smooth. You are allowed to leave the car and just walk around. Lake Victoria has always been my favorite waterboard in Kenya. but this spot was stolen by another lake. We drove all the way to a small town called Kitmikayi. Here, we slept in a hotel that didn't give us a very good experience by trying to change the price in the morning, claiming they had given Jen and Albert a bigger room. A quick tip: when in a hotel, always confirm the price when being shown a room to avoid any misunderstandings in the morning. That aside, in the morning we visited the Kitmikayi rocks for a quick visit. This is one of my favorite spots in Nyanza region, although the stories usually sound made up, but I guess that's what happens when stories are passed down for generations. The rock formation is impressive, and if you go in the evening, you get to catch a good sunset. We drove to Kisumu and drove around the streets of Kisumu before proceeding to the Kisumu Museum. Right after we got into the museum, we got a puncture at the parking lot. That was the second puncture of the trip. At this point, we could become safari rally mechanics with the amount of tire changes done, and the lack of tools for lowering the tire made the whole situation even worse every time. Kisumu Museum was interesting to see. You get to learn about the culture of mostly the Luo people and other communities from Western Kenya. There is also an aquarium which has different types of fishes that are found in Lake Victoria. We headed north, and the next stop was at a popular tourist destination in Western Kenya called the Crying Stone. The irony is that the stone stopped crying, and it only does during the rainy season. Legend has it that the gods were angry, so it stopped crying, and it signified long drought. The place looked not very well maintained, but it was a worthy visit. The final destination of the day was the Kakamega forest. I visit Karura Forest quite often, but if Kakamega Forest was in Nairobi, that will be my new favorite place for walking or cycling. The dense forest of Kakamega was beyond surreal. You could feel like you're breathing pure air, and the sounds of birds singing just gave it a completely different mood from all the parks we had visited so far. Kakamega Forest is the only remaining true tropical forest in Kenya, and its vegetation can only be compared to the forests in Congo. We walked for a while and went up a hill to a viewpoint, and you could see how thick the forest is. Again, for me, this was the highlight of the day. Oh, and we had the third puncture in Kakamega Forest just when we got in. Our day ended in an Airbnb in Kakamega town ready for the next day. A very early morning drive led us to Kakapel National Monument. This place has some rock cuts which also date about 5,000 years old from the Neolithic times. There is a hiking trail that you can do, but our focus was to hike our next destination. Next stop was the Kitale Museum, where we got to learn about the culture of Western Kenya. It also has a snake park and a small picnic site. Kitale is a very busy town when driving through it, but we were out in no time and headed straight to Mount Elgon. I didn't know what to expect of Mount Elgon, but it turned out to be a very underrated destination in Kenya. I don't know anyone who has ever been there, and there hasn't been much talk from people about it. The first visit we did in Mount Elgon was exploring the caves. Kitum Cave was very interesting in that it's the only cave in the world where elephants walk inside to lick salt. The elephants have been doing that for hundreds of years, and even more impressive is that they do it at night in pitch black darkness. The cave is very huge and deep. If you're afraid of darkness or claustrophobic, it will be a good place to face your fears. The cave also had thousands of bats, which if you shine a light on them, they will disperse in all directions. The next cave worth exploring is the Makingeny Cave, which is also equally impressive. It is huge and had a waterfall when going in. We moved around the park a bit, and the day ended by sleeping in a Kenya Wildlife Service banda, which is a self-contained house inside the park. This was to make it convenient for the next day climbing the mountain. I did mention how Mount Elgon is very underrated. At the back of my mind, I always thought Mount Elgon is a hill and not a mountain. And when I saw it, looking at the peak that we were to climb, I thought, how hard could it be? Spoiler, it was very hard. We drove for about 20 kilometers to the start of the trail. At this point, we were already at 3,500 meters elevation. You won't think of it or even feel anything until you start the climb. The first 2 kilometers of the climb was probably the most physically challenging thing I have ever done. The route was only steep for about 50 meters and then a gradual climb, but I felt like death. It was very cold and I think I was struggling with breathing. You see, before you climb a mountain, you need to acclimatize. That is being in the location for several hours so that your body can adjust to the lower oxygen levels. The higher you go, the lower the oxygen levels and also the colder it becomes. Geography 101. Sleeping in the bandas in Mount Elgon might have helped a bit with my body readjusting. I could feel I had breathing difficulties. I kept panting, but after the first 2 kilometers, my body was able to adjust and I could breathe normally through my nose and not my mouth like I was doing earlier. Mount Elgon is also known to have the largest base of a volcanic mountain. The views up the hill was just stunning as we crossed the changing mountain vegetations, from grasslands to bamboos and some beautiful ground cells. There were several streams up the mountain. We climbed and occasionally rested for a few minutes. The peak that we were going for is called Koitobos Peak, which stands at 4,222 meters high. I wasn't the only one who found it challenging. Albert also came close to giving up, but we had already come too far to give up. Our guide David was probably laughing at us, wondering what is wrong with us, as he seemed to have no issues at all. But then, he was born in the area and he has been up the mountain hundreds of times.
The toughest thing I've ever done.
We finally got to the top and the views were rewarding. First, that was my first time at such an elevation, and it was also the toughest hike I had ever done. Climbing Mount Elgon doesn't require any technical climbing skills, since the route is rather gradual and I think anyone who is physically fit can manage the climb. We sat at the top eating some biltongs and admiring the views, and then started the climb down. Going down was easy, although dangerous, because that's when you have a higher risk of slipping. Mount Elgon is a location I highly recommend you visit, whether you are a Kenyan or a foreigner. Add it to your list of must-do, and it will be worth the journey. We reached the beginning of the trail and drove down to one other cave called Makingeny. Jane was tired and not feeling like walking and decided to stay in the car. Me, Albert and our guide David went to the cave, and honestly, I was so tired I couldn't even appreciate it enough. We spent literally seconds taking a few pictures and we were out. We exited Mount Elgon and drove back to Kitale, ready to continue further north. The day started very early, around 6 AM, and we drove to Saiwa Swamp National Park, which is the smallest national park in Kenya. The unique feature of this park is that it is the only place in Kenya where you can view the Sitatunga antelopes, which live on wetlands. The park was a good visit as we walked for about 5 kilometers inside trying to locate the antelopes. The park only has a foot trail and vehicles are not allowed inside. It is a small park and also a river goes right through it. There are several bridges that you walk on, as well as several viewing point structures you can climb to have a better view. We were lucky to see a few of the Sitatunga antelopes. It was my first time seeing them, but all the pictures that I got were just terrible. When visiting, make sure you have a binoculars. 2 hours later, we exited the park and continued heading north. The next stop was the Kapenguria Museum. This is a famous place for Kenyans and we learnt about it in school as it was where political prisoners were kept during the fight for independence. The museum is in pristine condition and you get to walk around and even get in what were once prison cells for Kenyan freedom fighters. Here, there is a prison cell that was once occupied by the President of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. After Kapenguria, we headed even further north to Turkana. and we made a quick stop at the Namorutunga settlement. This spot is very easy to miss since there are no signs and some locals were able to direct us where it is. It is commonly known as the Kolakol Pillar site. After a few minutes, we set off for Elie Springs, which is without a doubt the most popular destination in Turkana. Even for me as a Kenyan, Turkana had always been this mysterious place that mostly had only negative stories coming from it. From hunger, lack of development, sickness and droughts. After visiting Turkana for the first time, all my thoughts of the place completely changed. From all the travels in Kenya, Turkana is the only place I will say offers you a truly remote feel. It's like being very close to the edge of civilization as you drive through miles and miles of empty desert land. This is not to mean that Turkana is not civilized. In fact, Lodwar town is very busy just like any other towns in Kenya, and there isn't any amenity you can find in another place that you won't find in Turkana. But the vast lands of nothingness gives you a true desert feel that you won't find anywhere else in Kenya. We woke up very early hoping that we will be doing a boat ride to Central Island. Unfortunately, the waters of Lake Turkana had other ideas. The waves were very strong, which will make the boat ride dangerous. We spent another 1 hour hoping the lake would calm down, but that didn't happen. To optimize time, we decided to drive to Turkana Boy, which was about 124 kilometers north in a town called Naivasha. This journey didn't go so smoothly, as we did one of the greatest blunders in the car world. When you go to some random petrol stations where the pumps are not labeled, always ask which one is a diesel and which one is petrol. In Kolakol, we needed to fuel, therefore stopped by a roadside petrol station to fill up before proceeding to Turkana Boy. The petrol station had one attendant who didn't speak any English and his Kiswahili was bad. It was a challenge even for me to communicate with him. Albert, who was driving, switched off the car and the fuel attendant added fuel, and when he was done, I asked him why the price on that pump looked lower than the other. The attendant had initially said the pumps are all petrol, and it was an oversight on our side to not notice the pumps had different pricings. After he filled up, I asked him again why all the bikes were fueling on the other side, and we were the only ones using the other pump. That's when he said that pump is used for lorries. I felt my heart sinking because I knew at that moment that the car was dead. Luckily, Albert had completely switched off the car. So I quickly talked to the other guys who were already gathered at the petrol station and asked if they knew any mechanic. Out of all odds, we managed to find one mechanic who could remove the entire fuel tank, and he will drain the tank off the diesel. This whole process of removing the fuel tank, cleaning it and installing it back took 3 hours. We were able to fill up with the correct fuel, and the car was fine and didn't give us any errors. We had narrowly escaped killing a rental car which would have cost thousands of dollars to repair. If that was not luck, I don't know what will be considered luck. We then proceeded to drive all the way to Turkana Boy and saw the pillar, which marks a lot of human history, not just in Kenya but the world. It was exactly at this site that the oldest, almost full, early human remains were found, which date 1.6 million years old. It felt surreal standing there and imagining that 1.6 million years ago, an early human walked those lands. We took pictures, laid down and took even more pictures with the statue before starting our journey back to Elie. We tried to ask if it was possible to do a boat ride from Naivasha to Turkana's North Island. Unfortunately, there were no boats available. We drove all the way back to Elie and hoped the next day the lake would be calm and we could take the boat ride to Central Island. Still in Turkana, this day was another lucky day because the waters of Lake Turkana were calm and we could take the boat ride to Central Island. Turkana is beyond beautiful. Remember I said my love for Lake Victoria was overtaken by another lake? This was it. The boat ride was fun and scenic, with the sun still rising, and when you look back, you could see the desert sand dunes along the shores of Lake Turkana. We reached Central Island, and as it has been for most parts of the trip, we were again not ready for how challenging the walk will be. The island had a few hill climbs which were not steep. You gradually climb up a hill which sounds fun and easy until you realize you are doing it in 36 degrees Celsius, and it's only 9 AM in the morning. The route was very scenic though, and I took some amazing shots during the climb. Central Island is classified under the UNESCO World Heritage Program, which seeks to protect areas of significance. The island has 3 lakes, namely Crocodile Lake, Flamingo Lake, and Tilapia Lake. The lakes had fitting names since we could see the crocodiles and the flamingos. We spent about 2 hours walking the hiking route before going back to our boat and riding back to Elie Springs. Reaching Elie, it was still early and we decided to do a drive back to Kitale as we continued with our journey. A quick stop in Lodwar to fuel, we proceeded for roughly 100 kilometers before the car just failed. At this point, we were not sure what the problem could be. We had cleaned the bad fuel from the previous mishap and went on to drive about 300 kilometers without any issues. The previous mishap couldn't have been the issue, and this will make sense later because guess what? We killed another car, but we will get there. The car displayed several errors on the dashboard. The check engine light was on, a hazard sign, and a sign written 4LO. This caused the car to not accelerate beyond 40 km per hour, even on a very tiny hill. This became a problem because the route involved climbing a lot of hills going through the Cherangani Hills. Our solution was to drive for a few kilometers, and whenever the car lost power, we would switch it off, remove the battery terminal, and give it a few minutes before proceeding. We continued to do this until we managed to reach Kitale late at night. Our aim was to reach Kitale because this is where the closest Toyota service center was located. We reached Kitale late at night around 8 PM and slept in an Airbnb. We had avoided driving at night through the journey because there's a curfew in Kenya from 10 PM to 5 AM as part of the COVID restrictions. This turned out to be a very slow day that, thinking about it right now, actually went very well. First stop was the Toyota service center in Kitale. They spent 2 hours working on the car and they said the car had a lot of dust and needed cleaning. I'm not a car nerd, therefore didn't know what the solution for that was. The car didn't have any errors and they assured us it was perfect. It wasn't. 70 kilometers from Kitale, the problem came back with all the lights on the dashboard lighting up again. The only advantage this time was that the speed during hill climbs was not affected, and therefore we were able to drive till evening. At this point, Jane had already talked to the rental car company and they were going to give us a second car. We drove through Eldoret town all the way to Iten. We stopped for a few minutes in Iten taking pictures of a road sign. Iten is famously known as the home of marathon runners, since most of Kenya's marathon runners come from the area. Here, they get to train at high altitude, which helps in building endurance. Our next quick stop was at the Elgeyo Marakwet viewpoint. I thought the sign written EMC was a tribute to Albert Einstein, but it just meant Elgeyo Marakwet County. Blonde moments. We drove down the escarpment and made another stop at the Tambach Museum, which was along the way. We had a quick view of the museum, which holds some political significance. It was one of the oldest towns established back in 1920 as a British colonial outpost. It was later changed to offices of District Commissioner after independence. The original building is still standing in the site. We then continued down the escarpment for another stopover at the Kabarnet Museum. Here, there was a showcase of the culture of the Kalenjin tribe, who are the occupants of the area. The car problems had kind of affected the general mood of the travel, but the road down the escarpments was beyond magical. I can confidently say that the Iten to Baringo road is the most scenic road in Kenya. The landscape has an amazing winding road and hills that look they were carefully placed. We continued the drive down with several stopovers, admiring the views until we reached the shores of Lake Baringo. Here, we were able to secure a boat for the next day and retired to a nearby hotel. The car rental company was able to deliver the second car to the hotel, and we hoped all will be well, but as it happened to be, the car problems were not over. There has been a lot of stories about the rising water levels of lakes along the Rift Valley. It is suspected that this is as a result of lots of rain from 2019 and 2020, and also effects of climate change. We saw how the water levels had risen in Lake Turkana, but in Lake Baringo, we had even a bigger picture of how the situation was. We took a boat early in the morning for a 1 hour 30 minutes boat ride. During the ride, we could see a lot of structures that were submerged inside the water because of the rising levels. Some hotels were completely decommissioned, and structures and homesteads abandoned. This is the reality that you are going to see while visiting all the other lakes along Rift Valley. We drove to the Olkokwe Island inside Lake Baringo, which has hot springs, before riding back to the mainland. Back to the mainland, the next destination was to be Lake Bogoria, and there was supposed to be a tarmac road that goes along Lake Baringo all the way to Lake Bogoria. Only one slight problem: the entire road was underwater. The flamingos stopped us right at our tracks. We took some pictures and had to trace back our route to go around several kilometers. We drove down to Nakuru town, which is one of the major towns in Kenya. While in Nakuru, we made a quick stopover at Lord Egerton Castle, which was built back in 1938 by a British baron during the colonial period. The time was around 2 p.m. and we decided to take a shot at reaching Lake Bogoria again. We got lost for a bit and found ourselves to the lesser known Lake Solai, which is still in the floor of the Rift Valley. After asking for directions, we were told to use a shortcut, which was a dirt road, and because of how bad the road was, it ended up being a long cut. We reached Lake Bogoria at 4:30 p.m. late in the evening. My childhood memory of going to Lake Bogoria was boiling eggs in the hot springs. I didn't have any eggs this time round, but I completely forgot just how stunning the lake was. The lake looked perfectly placed, with the escarpments rising all around it. The lake also had the highest number of flamingos yet. We spent about an hour driving around and stopped at the hot springs, and I think I have 1,000 pictures of flamingos from this one location only. It was running late and there were no accommodations nearby. This was a result of the rising water levels and also COVID. We set to drive back to Nakuru. Along the way, around 50 kilometers out of Nakuru, we got another puncture. If you are counting, this brings the total number of punctures to 4. In Nakuru town, the main attraction is Lake Nakuru, which is inside the Nakuru National Park. But first, we needed to repair another tire puncture because you can't risk going to a park without a spare wheel. We fixed the tire, then did a quick visit to the Hyrax Hill Museum. The museum showcases the culture of the tribes in the area and also has prehistoric sites that are centuries old. We went up the hill and had a good view of the entire Nakuru town and a view of the lake. Around 11 a.m., we went to Lake Nakuru National Park. We first accessed the park via the main gate, and the guards were able to show us the famous 3 meters high gate that is now underwater. To have access to the park, we had to go around and access it via the Lanet gate. By the time we were in the park, it was already noon, which is not the best time to be in a park because animals are less active and it is hard to spot them. We drove around for about 2 hours before deciding to exit the park and head towards Naivasha. We made a quick stop at Lake Elementaita. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a good view of the lake since most of it is not accessible because of hotels fencing most parts. We gave up on that and decided to proceed to Naivasha. The ride to Naivasha was quite interesting for me because Albert, who was driving, got his first real experience of driving on a busy Kenyan road. Trust me, you only need to do it to have an opinion of your own. You might enjoy it or you might hate it, but at the end of the day, you just have to be aggressive to survive. Our plan was to view Lake Naivasha the next day, and so we slept in an Airbnb which was just nearby. Hell's Gate is another famous tourism location in Kenya. Most people do cycling and camping. It also hosts events occasionally. We drove around viewing animals like antelopes and buffaloes and exited close to the geothermal power plant. Our next stop was at Crescent Camp in Naivasha. Here we were able to get a boat which took us for an hour ride in the lake. Again, some structures were underwater due to the rising water levels. Lake Naivasha is very popular with people who love birdwatching since it has over 300 different bird species, including migratory birds. After Naivasha, we got back on the road and drove to another prehistoric site named the Kariandusi Museum. This was a unique location because it is at this site where thousands of early man tools were discovered. The early man, being hunters and gatherers, used stone carvings as tools for hunting millions of years ago. After a tour of the site, we proceeded with our trip to Aberdares National Park. Unfortunately, we reached Aberdares very late and had only 1 hour of driving before we needed to exit the park. Aberdares is a popular spot for hikers, with many hikers saying it has one of the best hiking trails in Kenya. Some of the roads were inaccessible in the park because of rains, and so we exited the park to Nyeri town. In Nyeri town, we made a quick visit to the Baden Memorial. Baden is famed as one of the founders of the Scouts movement and Girl Guide Scout movement. He died in 1941 and was buried in Nyeri, with his tombstone being accessible for people to visit. You simply don't cross an equator sign without taking a picture. That was the first stop of this day as we headed to Olpejeta Conservancy. Olpejeta is famous for being the location of the 2 remaining northern white rhinos, and the rhinos are under 24-hour security. Olpejeta is also the only place in the world with a rhino cemetery. That was odd but interesting to see. The biggest disappointment with Olpejeta was how expensive it is. For Jen and Albert, the cost was $70 per person as gate entry fees, and in case you wanted to see the northern white rhinos, you will need to pay an extra $60 per person. That is for Jen and Albert. We settled on seeing a very small part of the rhinos' backs, which were lying on some tall grass, and called it a day. We left the park quite disappointed, but our moods were back up when we got to Mount Kenya Animal Sanctuary. The sanctuary hosts the bongo antelope, which is native to Aberdares National Park here in Kenya. Unfortunately, it is very hard to spot, with it being spotted only a few times in several months, and mostly done with motion capture cameras. For Albert, his dream of seeing a caracal was fulfilled, although it was not in the best condition since it was in a cage. I assumed that was good enough for him to see it for the first time in more than 20 years of traveling. I also got an exciting animal to see. That was a llama. These animals are native to cold regions, and the sanctuary was able to get them as a donation several years ago. After visiting the Mount Kenya Sanctuary, we drove to the gate of Mount Kenya National Park and inquired about climbing Mount Kenya. Unfortunately, the entire mountain was covered in the clouds and was not visible due to bad weather, and we abandoned the plan hoping it would be better when we drove down back from Turkana. It never got better. We left the park and drove to Meru, ready to visit Meru National Park the following day. We got to the park very early in the morning for an early morning drive. but that was cut short when we got a puncture 3 kilometers after the main gate. We had to exit the park and drive back to Meru town to get a new tire. The puncture was huge and a patch wouldn't have worked. We went to Meru town and ended up buying a fake tire called Windforce. We drove back to the park, and again a few kilometers in, the new tire had a very huge puncture which again could not be patched. Lucky for us, the rental company agreed to replace the tire, including the spare tire which looked worn out. With a few hours remaining before sunset, we drove back to Meru Park again and managed to drive around for only 2 hours. Meru National Park is one of the largest parks in Kenya, and the time frame we spent was very little. We ended the day by sleeping in a hotel that is just a few kilometers from the gate, and planned to do a lot more driving of Meru National Park the following day. Accessing Meru National Park also gives you access to Mwingi National Reserve and Kora National Reserve. We reached the gate of the park by 7 AM ready for the drive. The park stretches 80 kilometers from end to end, and the roads are well maintained and can be accessed easily. We drove through the park without any luck seeing many animals. We drove all the way to Kora National Park and reached the grave of George Adamson, who was a conservationist and died in the hands of poachers. The drive in Meru and Kora felt remote, with hours of driving without seeing any other person or car. It will make for a very good camping location for those who want to escape the city life for a few days. We left the park late afternoon and drove all the way to Isiolo. Throughout the trip, the plan was to always get as close as possible to the next destination. On this day, we left Isiolo very early in the morning for what was a full day drive. The drive was from Isiolo to Laisamis and then all the way to Loyangalani, which is a small town on the shores of Lake Turkana. The drive was long as we crossed desert land and dried rivers. The first stop was at the Turkana wind power project, where we were able to fuel before proceeding to Loyangalani. Unlike the first side of Turkana we visited, which was sandy, this side was very rocky. The scenery was hilly and the mountains looked like new volcanic mountains. The ride went on for hundreds of kilometers and we rarely saw any other car on the route. Several hours later, we got close to Loyangalani and we reached what I would consider the best entry to a town in Kenya. The hills paved the way to the lake in what can only be described as magical. We kept making several stops as we took pictures and soaked in the views of Lake Turkana. If you visit Turkana, you must visit both sides to have the full experience. One side is just not enough. Ahead you could see the South Island and from afar, the Namorutunga crater. The drive went on for a few more kilometers and we finally reached Loyangalani. My biggest disappointment with Loyangalani was that it didn't have any power connection. This was despite the wind power project being only less than 70 kilometers from them. We went to the shores of the lake and we were able to secure park entry tickets to visit the South Island the following day. We ended the day in Malabo Hotel for the night. After a long day of being on the road, we were ready for another boat ride in Lake Turkana. Early morning as usual, the boat ride to Namorutunga felt like it took forever. The ride took 1 hour 40 minutes and we were using a boat with twin engines. The water was very choppy too, which contributed to the long time. From the boat, you got to see the hills around and how rocky the terrain is. We finally reached Namorutunga and were ready to hike the hill. Namorutunga crater stands at only 384 meters high, and it is very easy to dismiss the climb thinking it's going to be very easy. The hill has an incline of about 50 degrees, making it very steep when going up. Climbing the hill also happened to be extremely physically challenging. I am still debating if it was tougher than the first 2 kilometers of Mount Elgon. When you start climbing, the thought that the hill is not high wears down very fast. The route is very rocky and some rocks are loose, and our guide John kept reminding us to be on the watch out. We kept stopping to catch our breath maybe every 10 minutes. Climbing to the top took close to an hour, and I think the heat was 40 degrees Celsius. While climbing the hill, the reward was sitting and turning back to look at the spectacular views of Lake Turkana and the lava fields that stretched for kilometers. The hills around looked black because of all the volcanic ash. We kept on climbing the hill and I was sweating like fish. John, on the other hand, was having a field day climbing the mountain like it was nothing. He has done it hundreds of times and he is used to it. After the treacherous climb, we managed to reach the top. We had all run out of water, and that is a quick side note if you ever go to climb. You need at least 2 liters of water because the scorching sun will make you feel dehydrated very quickly. The views from the top were nothing short of glorious. I have seen hundreds of pictures of the crater taken from helicopters and drones, but never from close range. And I have to say, you need to climb the top and see it for yourself. The crater was dry and didn't have any water like it usually looks from all the drone shots, but that didn't take away from the beauty. We walked around the crater to get an even closer look of the lava fields before starting the climb down. The climb down was equally challenging because the rocks were slippery and I reckon if someone falls from the place, they could end up with scars. I was extremely tired by the time I got down and just had to rest under an acacia tree to catch my breath before proceeding to walk back to the boat. Again, I highly recommend climbing up the hill. It is quite an adventure with very good spectacles. We reached the boat very exhausted and the next stop was the Southern Island. Southern Island is also classified as a UNESCO heritage site. The island is not habited, but it has nature trails and a camping ground, and I was told it has so many snakes. The ride took about 40 minutes to reach the island and we were able to rest on the beach for a while. Still tired from climbing Egerton, nobody was interested in doing any more climbs on the island, and so we left the island and headed back to Loyangalani. Our guide John took us to one rock arts location to view rock arts dating back to early Neolithic times. We then drove to the Desert Museum, which preserves and showcases history of the local tribes and traditions, and that brought the day to an end. We went back to Loyangalani and slept at Oasis Resort, and the next day we were to continue going further north to Sibiloi and Kobi Fora. The drive from Loyangalani to Sibiloi National Park felt like the most remote drive in the whole trip. Because we didn't know the routes, we had an escort car with John and the owner of Oasis Resort, Benedict, accompanying us with his car. The road changed from rocks to sand as we passed through both rocky and sandy deserts. Sibiloi National Park is roughly 130 kilometers from Loyangalani, and the ride took about 5 to 6 hours. In Sibiloi Park, we were not lucky to view any animals apart from a few antelopes. This is as a result of human encroachment into the park, which is something that is affecting several other parks in Kenya too. The first stop we did was at the petrified forest where we saw some petrified trees. These are trees that are millions of years old and have been fossilized. We then proceeded to Kobi Fora, which was another 50 kilometers from the main Sibiloi gate. The drive there took us another 4 hours, which made this day technically a full day of driving. In Kobi Fora, we walked to the edge of the peninsula and watched an amazing sunset over Lake Turkana. Later at night, I had promised everyone I was going to make ugali for supper, so here is just a silly video of me making ugali. Welcome to Nash Kitchen, Nash Temporary Kitchen. We've light up a fire. This is a traditional way of lighting up a fire, especially if you want to cook so many things. It's more economical, put some firewood. Then we have the sufuria and some water inside. So to make ugali, that's the first step. While you do other things like cutting cabbages, which is being cut on this side. Yeah. The guy's name is John. He's busy cutting the cabbages, although he's complaining that that knife is very small. So it's a lot of work. And And he's also complaining that the flour that we have is very small also, you know. This is a 1 kg flour, and for 3 men to eat ugali, they need like 2 kgs. So we are 5, which means most of us will sleep hungry, but anyway. So the steps for making ugali: once the water has boiled, we'll add the flour slowly while you spin using this. We call it a mwiko. Although this mwiko is very old and crooked, but yeah, it will serve the purpose. So we use the mwiko to stir the flour until it thickens and becomes like solid. Then we turn it to another plate and ugali is ready. So it takes only like 5-10 minutes at most, so that it can cook well. So yes, see you in a bit when we start cooking. Come to part 2. We got a better mwiko for circling the thing, and now it's time to make the actual ugali. So the water is already boiling, so we just need to add some flour. This water looks like it's a lot. I think some of us are going to sleep hungry. A quick disclaimer, I am not a professional cook. If this backfires, it's not on me.
It's lumpy.
Yeah, it's lumpy. Yeah, I think we're going to use up all this flour. Yeah, so it's starting to thicken. So we need to keep doing this so that the flour can turn all sides. At this point, you can drink it as porridge. Badly made porridge. No, the flour will be enough. Okay. No, this is very big ugali. This is in fact the biggest ugali I've ever cooked. So it's a new record for me.
Is this looking good or bad?
Yeah?
Is this good or bad looking?
No, it's turning out well, surprisingly. I'm even shocked. I'm shocked at my own skill. I didn't expect it to go this well. I thought we were all sleeping hungry.
That's a lot of ugali, no?
Yeah? You think? It's not.
Or is this just for John?
This is just for John. Let's start shaping it.
So you make a ball?
Yeah, you make it like a ball. Then the problem with this fire is that you can't regulate it. So it's just like burning. To everyone, I am really sorry. The ugali is not as hard as it's supposed to be. Because I underestimated the amount of flour. But it should be fine. Yeah, and that's it. So.
And that's ugali.
Wait, I think, yeah.
It's good, no?
Where is the plate? I think there's a plate outside here. And I'm even sweating. From all this heat.
Don't burn yourself.
Okay, time to turn it.
With cabbage? And here we have it.
Yeah, there's the plate.
Ugali a la prehistoric style.
In a prehistoric site. The cradle of mankind.
Do you think they made ugali back then?
Ta-da!
It looks amazing.
The shape is almost perfect. I'm really proud of this. I think this is the best ugali I've ever made. If it's sweet or bitter, I honestly don't care. I just care about the shape. So yeah, now
I
this is
think
a fun thing people do when we were kids. You will let this dry out, then it will like come off. Then
Lift
you
it
eat
up.
it.
Like a pancake.
Exactly like a pancake. It's sweet. It has its own kind of taste. So yeah, you cook ugali first, then everything else follows. So I think we need to wash these to make the cabbages. And cabbages is just normal, so nothing fancy. Yes, and that has been it for the ugali video. With the ugali still in our stomachs, we explored the fossil sites of Kobi Fora. There are 3 locations in Kobi Fora with fossils named the Crocodile Pit, the Tortoise Pit, and the Elephant Pit. Here, we got to see the remains of animals that walked the earth some 2 million years ago. The tortoise was particularly impressive as it measured almost 4 times the size of what the largest tortoise on the planet currently is. After visiting the pits, we were on our way back to Sibiloi. The distance this time felt shorter because we used a shortcut that the rangers guided us through. If I ever want to go to a place that I know I will be completely disconnected with the rest of the world in Kenya, Kobi Fora is the place I think of going. Several weeks later, and I still feel like I need to go back and spend at least a week there. Our initial plan after leaving Sibiloi Park was to go to Marsabit through Chalbi Desert, but the car decided to have other plans. We got the same errors on the dashboard as we did with the first car while leaving Lodwar. The dashboard showed the 4LO sign, a hazard sign, and the check engine light was on. The car lost power on the slightest of hills and it kept on dragging. The solution again was disconnecting the battery terminal and switching off the car for a minute before proceeding. With such a level of unreliability, it was wise not to proceed with the plan of going to Chalbi Desert, lest we get stuck there and have to wait for hours before anyone could pass and help us. We opted to go back to Loyangalani and go to Marsabit the next day via a safer route with more towns. Marsabit is 240 kilometers away from Loyangalani, and the route is rocky and sandy with zero tarmac road. This meant leaving early so as to try and reach Marsabit as early as possible. The drive took 5 hours 30 minutes, and technically we got to experience a bit of the Chalbi Desert while driving through the desert roads all the way to Marsabit. On the positive side, the car didn't lose power that often, like with the previous car, but it still required doing a few stops. We reached Marsabit town by 1 PM and it was early enough to drive through the Marsabit National Park. The park was very dense with green vegetation, which was a sharp contrast from the dry and dusty roads we had just used. The park also has this beautiful crater lake called Lake Paradise, which from the viewpoint looked just stunning. I don't remember seeing any animals in the park. The only animals I saw were the Grevy's zebras, which are unique in that they can only be found in northern Kenya and Ethiopia. That is in the whole world. Close to 2 hours in the park, we exited and started the drive back down towards Isiolo. Jane had already contacted the rental company and they were bringing the third car. We drove all the way down to Lions Cave Camp, which is along the shores of River Ewasonyiro, and here the rental company was able to deliver the third car. The third car happened to be worse than the first 2 cars. The shocks were worn out, and worse, one of the windows once down did not go up. This might sound like a small annoyance until you factor in driving inside national parks full of dust, and also driving in rain if you go further south towards Mount Kenya. The day started with visiting Buffalo Springs National Reserve. We circled around for a bit before leaving for Samburu National Reserve. Samburu National Reserve is a very good park with so many elephants walking along the river. We drove around some more, and I think we generally were not lucky with viewing smaller animals in the parks. Maybe they had their own New Year resolutions of not wanting to be seen. Just had. Next was the Shaba National Reserve, which is just a few kilometers from Samburu National Reserve. The vegetation and landscape was similar to Samburu National Reserve. After about an hour of driving, we exited the park and drove all the way down to Nairobi. The weather was still bad to climb on Kenya and the plan was cancelled. Did I mention we were getting the 4th car? Yes, Jen and Albert at this point had already given up on the cars, and they even thought of ending the trip, and so we reached Nairobi and luckily the rental company offered to give us another car. This might be a good time to talk about all the car problems at once. The rental company was done through Hertz. Hertz on their part have partnerships with car rental companies in different countries who supply the vehicle to clients. Think of Hertz like Uber. They don't own cars, but they are a platform to connect you with car rentals. One problem with cars in Kenya is that we import old cars mostly from Japan and Singapore. If I was to buy a car today, I will most likely buy a car from an auction in Japan and have it imported. Alternatively, I'll buy one from a carrier that has already imported the cars and I don't need to go through the whole process of importing. In Kenya, cars imported must be within 8 years of date of manufacture. Right now in 2021, I can only buy a Toyota Corolla that was manufactured in 2014. Nothing older. What this means is that most people import cars that are 8 years old. Buying a brand new car from a car dealership is very expensive for most people, with only governments and large corporations being able to afford them. It's because of this reason why I wouldn't blame the car rental company for their cars failing. I assume their cars are not used to be rented for extended periods of time doing hundreds of kilometers per day. But that is not an excuse for bad maintenance. Two cars failing in the same exact way is quite a coincidence. Just to remind you of all the car predicaments, the first one was getting a puncture on top of Mount Suswa. The tire was slashed on the side with thorns and that required a large patch. The patch was done while in Narok. Unfortunately, it didn't last because the next day, close to Maasai Mara gate, the patch ripped off. This meant purchasing a new tire, and so we went back to Narok town and bought a new tire. The next car mishap was getting another tire puncture while entering the Kisumu National Museum. This was an easy puncture to fix and only required a plug. Another puncture we got was when we entered Kakamega National Park. Just right outside the gate, I realized the car is losing air, and so we had to change the tire, but again that was an easy puncture to fix, just requiring a plug. The next car problem was partly our fault. If anyone from the car rental company sees this, I am very sorry. We went to a petrol station and the fuel attendant added diesel instead of petrol. Luckily, the car engine was off and we got a mechanic to drain all the fuel and clean the tank. We went on to drive 300 kilometers without any issues. We then fueled at a petrol station in Lodwar and set off for Kitale, and this is when the car developed a new issue. It kept losing power, especially when going up a hill. Due to its own automatic mechanism to protect the car, it couldn't drive at speeds of more than 40 km per hour. We were so far out and the solution was to disconnect the battery terminal to reset the memory and then proceed until it locked us again. The following day, we went to a Toyota service center in Kitale who did a check and service of the car. They said the problem was dust and they had repaired the car. We left the service center and drove for about 60 kilometers before the problem came back again with all the errors on the dashboard lighting up like before. At this point, Jen was able to get in touch with the rental company and they offered to replace the car. I have to say the rental company was very quick in remedying any issues we had. While in Baringo, they gave us another Toyota Prado G150 which we were to continue the journey with. The next puncture was when we entered Meru National Park. It again looked like a tire slash and needed a new tire. We drove back to Meru town and unknowingly bought a fake tire called Windforce. We drove back to Meru National Park and less than 3 kilometers inside, the tire had a huge hole which was irreparable. The rental company was able to secure good tires and again, we drove back to Meru town and had the tire replaced including the spare tire which looked very worn out. We went back to Meru National Park the following day without any issues. The car performed well until we went back to Lake Turkana and we were driving back down. Turkana is dusty and the temperatures can go above 36 degrees Celsius. It was my assumption that the heat might have an effect on the fuel pumps dying. Looking online, the Toyota G150 was recalled because of faulty fuel pumps. So maybe that was the problem. Anyway, the rental company gave us the third car, which was a Toyota Fortuner. The car looked older and more beat up, so it was not surprising that the windows failed to go up when you took it down. It had a bit of rattling noise and the shocks were quite worn out. We drove back to Nairobi and we got again another Prado G150. Luckily this time, the car was able to perform well throughout the whole trip. That brought the total number of punctures to 5, 2 fuel pumps failing, and using 4 cars in a 29 days trip around Kenya. Now that we are caught up with all the tire problems, back to the second half of the trip. With a new car and renewed spirits, we set off for one of the most popular tourist spots in Kenya, Amboseli National Park. There are good reasons why it is very popular. A view of Mount Kilimanjaro with elephants walking in front of it is one of those shots no photographer will resist taking. After about 3 hours, we reached the park, and to my disappointment, Kilimanjaro was not visible even a tiny bit. We drove around taking pictures of giraffes and lots of elephants. Amboseli National Park, even though it's a popular place, it is still a very good park to visit, and you can do it in a day easily. We had entered the park from Namanga and we exited via Kimani Gate and continued south towards Lake Chala. The road to Lake Chala was terrible. There were sections that were recently washed out and had huge holes that can swallow a bus. The road is rough and narrow. It was already late and we ended our day in an Airbnb close to Lake Chala to make it easy to access it the next day. In the morning, we went for a short drive to the trails that leads to Lake Chala. Lake Chala is a crater lake that lies between the borders of Kenya and Tanzania. Most of it is on the Tanzanian side. When going up, there's a small section that divides Kenya and Tanzania, and so you can technically cross over to Tanzania illegally and make fun of that. The lake was magnificent in the morning with its clear waters. A few pictures later, we were off and started the journey even further south. The next stop was the Grogan's Castle, which was owned by a baron during colonial times, but is recently owned by the Kenyatta family. Grogan's Castle gives you a sense of opulence and glamour, and its setup is just fitting. It is situated on top of a hill overlooking plantations, which depending on which side of the world you come from will look spectacular or give you flashbacks of colonial times even though you never experienced it. After a quick breakfast, the journey continued further south towards Lake Jipe, another border lake. The lake was entirely covered in reeds, which made it hard to get a feel of it. We continued on to the Tsavo West Maktau Gate. Tsavo is another popular park with large herds of elephants. We drove around for a while and headed for the popular Mzima Springs. Here you could see the crocodiles in the water, and they have this enclosure which is underwater, giving you a good view of the fishes in the water. Our next stop was the Shetani lava flow. Here you could see the lava rocks that had dried after a volcanic eruption that took place only a century ago. Tsavo West is massive and needs a lot of time to explore. After a few hours, we went on to drive to Voi town, where we rested for the day, with plans of visiting Tsavo East the following day. Voi is not a very big town, and so we just passed through it on our way to Tsavo East National Park. We drove around Tsavo for about 5 hours, animal spotting and drifting across the grasslands and bushlands in the park. One interesting stop in the park was at the shores of the Galana. Here, you could see hippos and crocs lying on the rocks and very close to the shore. One other thing I was very curious about was the hill outcrop that seems to stretch for several kilometers. I have always been curious to know what it looked like at close range, but my curiosity wasn't filled. I still want to know how it looks from the top and what lies behind it. Therefore, that is an exploration for another day. We drove along the Galana River all the way to the exit, and from here we proceeded straight to Malindi town, aka Little Italy. It was still early enough to explore one more spot, and we headed to the Marafa Hell's Kitchen. People from the US will refer to this as a budget version of the Grand Canyon. Inside the Marafa Hell's Kitchen, temperatures can rise as high as 50 degrees during the day. The guide at Marafa did mention that the place is ever changing, with every rainy season because of the soil erosion that takes place.
The entire canyon now expands.
I see.
You see it's moving that side.
Yeah.
So if you come here after 2 years, 3 years, you find everything here has changed. It's different. Yeah.
He even mentioned in years to come it will get to extend to where his home is and he will have to move to another place. The place was particularly interesting walking inside and seeing the whole canyon. We drove back to Malindi town and ended the day in an Airbnb very close to the main town. Malindi is famed as Little Italy because it has several Italian joints and people from Italy love to vacation there. I still don't know why it has appealed to many Italians. If there is any Italian watching this video, please tell us why you love Malindi. The first stop was at the famed Vasco da Gama Pillar, which is a monument that has existed since 1498. It was good to see that the National Museums of Kenya did some renovation of the place. Paying to access Vasco da Gama Pillar also gives you access to the Malindi Museum. We did a calming walk along the beach heading towards the Malindi Jetty, which has been standing for over 70 years and is a favorite spot for people from Malindi. Next was the museum. Inside the museum, you get to learn about the Swahili culture and lifestyle as you walk in the exhibition. After a few more rounds in Malindi town, we went west towards Mombasa and made a stop at the Gede ruins. These are ruins that were inhabited with the Swahili people in the early 12th century, making them over 600 years old. It was interesting to see how people lived back then and the innovations like how they had underground tunnels which acted as air conditioning. We then continued to Mombasa and made a quick visit to Fort Jesus and Mombasa Old Town. You haven't been to Mombasa if you have never been to Fort Jesus. It's one of those spots where you have to visit, like a rite of passage. A walk in Mombasa Old Town is one of my favorite fun things to do while exploring the street food and coffee houses. Later on, we proceeded to the ferry crossing and continued to Diani. Diani is rated as Africa's best beach. I haven't been to other African beaches, therefore I can't confirm nor deny that claim. But walking along the shores is always relaxing. There are so many activities in Diani, therefore it is again a very popular spot for tourists and people who love water activities. Last stop for the day was at the Alibaba's Cave restaurant, which is famed for exterior decor. They had a dress code policy not allowing sleeveless shirts, which is a rule I kind of found to be bizarre, considering it's right next to the beach. But I guess their space, their rules. I didn't do a very good job documenting the foods we ate and sleeping places, but we mostly slept in reasonably priced hotels and Airbnbs ranging from $10 to $50. We were coming to the end of the trip on this day. We started the drive up north towards Nairobi. We made one stop at the Shimba Hills, which is just 50 kilometers north of Diani. Shimba Hills is said to have a very large number of elephants, which is a problem that spills over to creating human-wildlife conflicts. Elephants need large areas of land and they can be very destructive. It was therefore ironic though that I don't remember seeing any elephant on this day, but as it is with game drives, most things come down to luck. We exited the park after about 3 hours of driving and headed straight for Nairobi. At this point, Albert was technically a pro in driving our Kenyan roads, and we arrived in Nairobi late in the evening. I headed home and Jen and Albert booked a hotel close to the airport where they were going to do their COVID test before traveling back home in a few days. On this day, Jen and Albert called me to join them for a one-day drive back to Amboseli National Park. They only had less than 48 hours before they left Kenya, and so we were just maximizing time at this point. Remember when I told you that photographers love taking a picture of elephants with Mount Kilimanjaro as the background? We went to the park thinking we could get a picture of a warthog in front of Mount Kilimanjaro, because warthogs don't get much love. Unfortunately, Mount Kilimanjaro was only visible for about an hour, and by this time, we were not even inside the park. By the time we were inside the park, the mountain was covered with the clouds, and our goal of wanting to take a picture of a warthog in front of Kilimanjaro backfired. We drove around Amboseli for a few more hours, but then ended up spotting a hyena, which was quite spectacular. The trip finally came to an end for real this time. Personally, that was a trip of a lifetime and I was happy that I got to do it right in my own country I can confidently say I have traveled to almost all corners of my country and see what it offers. This gives me the confidence that eventually, when I get to do my epic trip around Africa, I will be able to appreciate it even more as I get to explore far regions, new cultures, meet new people, and hopefully grow as a better human from all the travel. I still have a few locations in Kenya that I want to visit and explore, like Mandera, Okichogio, and even further south towards the Tanzanian border. I hope this video also gets to inspire you to travel. Get out there with any budget and visit a new town, a new park, a new beach, etc. It can be for a day or for a few hours. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, little travel builds up in the memories. As of this moment, Jen and Albert are back in the USA safely, and they are thinking of where they will go next, but meanwhile, they are currently shoveling snow from their driveway. In Nairobi, it was hot, but now it's raining, which rarely happens in February. Thank you for watching this far, and see you in the next adventure, because there is still a lot more to explore.